Thanks, Alan. So this is another piece of research that came out of the Uganda REU impact evaluation. And the motivation for this is that we wanted to look at understanding what the effects were of people's social networks and information networks on the process of diffusion of the orange sweet potato technology. So diffusion turns out to be a really important way that people are going to gain access to the technology. I'll talk more about that in a minute, but this is primarily farmer-to-farmer exchange of orange sweet potato vines that's going to ultimately lead to other households gaining access to it. So the potential for networks to have an effect there is large. And so I worked with Scott McNiven at UC Davis, he's a graduate student at UC Davis, to try to measure those effects and see if we could learn what lies behind them. So this is relevant to a kind of a literature that has existed for a long time and has become very active again, looking at trying to address the question of why do some farmers adopt seemingly or fail to adopt seemingly beneficial agricultural technologies. Some do and some don't, but for many technologies that we think look like clear winners, you get very low adoption rates, particularly in Africa. So there's a lot of new literature on this. We want to look specifically at the contribution of networks to the adoption question. And specifically, we're not looking at adoption in the samples that Alan was talking about, of the treated samples in the household, but actually of their neighbors who live near them but were not part of the project. So they should have received it only through farmer-to-farmer diffusion. So that's the kind of spread question. The stick question for this paper is about whether or not those households continue to adopt over time. Why is it that some of them 2 years later, which is equivalent to 4 seasons later in Uganda, are continuing to grow orange sweet potato and others are not? And again, we look at whether networks play an important role there. Okay, so let's talk about networks for a minute. Why should it be that networks affect diffusion of crop technology? There's a lot of potential impact pathways here. A very important one could be a lack of information. So farmers don't know about the crop, they've just heard of it, but they don't know its characteristics, either agronomic characteristics, they don't know what it's like to consume, and they just may not know how to value it. It could be that they have a preference incompatibility. This thing is orange, and that's weird. Sweet potato are very common in Uganda. Lots of people consume them. 3/4 of households in our sample grew them. But they're traditionally white, and there's some very light yellow varieties around in Uganda. But until this project, except for in one other area of Uganda, the orange varieties were not known. So it looks different. It's sweeter. It smells different, and so there may just be a preference incompatibility. There's a few differences in terms of agronomic characteristics too. It could be that there are price distortions or transaction costs for gaining access to the planting material or for otherwise being engaged in this. Could be, so planting material would be the main transaction cost, gaining access to the vines that you need to be able to grow orange sweet potato, but there could be other market imperfections and other aspects. Heterogeneous returns has been something that's been looked at in a number of papers recently. Maybe it's just that we misunderstand that some farmers are really good at growing certain crops and that for other farmers the returns to those crops are actually negative. So we've started to look at that. We have a little bit of evidence on that. And then it may be that their risk preferences vary as well. So let me tell you a little bit about the orange sweet potato. Alan has talked about this a little bit. I just want to compare traits so that you have a little bit better understanding of what farmers were going through in their decisions to decide to grow the orange variety. And again, we had a large number of farmers, 3/4 in our sample, that were already growing the traditional or conventional white sweet potato. So the orange sweet potato was also conventionally bred. These are not GMOs, conventionally bred in Uganda. They are drier, there's more labor required to manage the crop in the dry season than the traditional variety, modestly so, but it seems to have mattered. Adoption at baseline in 2007 was very low. It essentially did not exist in the areas that we were working, whereas, as I said, 3/4 of households were growing orange or white sweet potato. It's a sweeter crop to consume, and it's a much more dense source of vitamin A. The beauty of vitamin A is that how orange the crop is a very good indicator of whether it has a lot of vitamin A or not. So these very orange varieties, which look a lot like the kind of yams or orange sweet potato that people eat here at Thanksgiving in the United States, they're a really rich source of vitamin A. Okay, so Harvest Plus is undertaking a strategy, and they're doing this for other micronutrients with other crops, but here for vitamin A with orange sweet potato, Harvest Plus is taking the strategy, could we use the dissemination and broad adoption of this crop as a way to actually reduce vitamin A deficiency, as an agricultural intervention to actually address a public health concern, a major public health concern. So vitamin A deficiency impairs the immune system. In severe cases, it causes night blindness. It's associated with child mortality. In the Lancet series some years ago, they claimed it was responsible for 6% of all deaths in children under 5. It's a major public health problem, and it's also a significant public health problem in Uganda. The leading strategy for reducing vitamin A deficiency is through supplementation. Child health days twice a year to give children access to vitamin A supplements. There's a program like that in Uganda. The coverage rates in Uganda are about 65% of children who actually get reached that way. So it's not reaching everyone. Annually, the costs globally are $450 million a year. So if you could actually get farmers growing orange sweet potato and continuing to grow it over time, Alan showed you the costs of doing that, right, in this project, in an intensive pilot project over a 2-year period. Well, many of those farmers, and we've actually gone back, are continuing to grow it. So those costs kind of, as you add benefits over time, the costs are declining. And so it could be that ultimately this could be a cost-effective strategy in some areas. It's not everybody's going to be growing orange sweet potato. We understand that, but it could play an important role. Okay, so the question is then, why do we care about networks in this setting? So as I mentioned, orange sweet potato and all sweet potatoes are grown by vines. The sweet potatoes themselves grow underground. They can be stored in the ground for some time and then taken out piecemeal to consume over time. These are not seeds that you can maintain between seasons. You put them in storage and take them out again and put them in the ground in the next season. You have to maintain the vines in the ground between seasons, water them, keep them going, and which in Mozambique was a serious problem, which is why they ended up distributing orange sweet potato every year there. In Uganda, they gave them once, and then people multiplied them out and shared them with their neighbors. So it's really farmer-to-farmer diffusion that's the main driving mechanism of this spreading, and again, the public health benefits of this potentially spreading. So the relationships between people that are exchanging the planting material could be very important. So that's what we wanted to look at. So here's a quick introduction to the project. Alan already talked about this, but some specifics from Uganda. There was a randomized design of the REU impact evaluation. 48 farmer groups were randomly assigned to receive orange sweet potato. 36 farmer groups were randomly assigned to be into the control group. The treatment had 3 parts. Each household in the treated farmer groups received 20 kilos of OSB vines, which is equivalent to about enough to plant a quarter of an acre. Some trainings on cooking, nutrition, and marketing, and then promoters were also trained to provide additional technical assistance to farmers. So that was the main treatment. We're actually going to look at the effects of that treatment. So that was given to, picture a farmer group operating in a community of about 100 to 120 households. Farmer groups typically have around 28 members. So there's a lot of people living around them who were not given access to the planting material because they're not in the group. We're actually going to only work in treated communities, the farmer groups that are randomly assigned into the REU treatment, and we're going to look at the effects of those people gaining access to sweet potato on whether or not their neighbors gained access as well. So here's what that looks like. We have on the left, the randomized controlled trial is the results that Alan has already presented to you. That was our original impact evaluation. Here we're doing what we're calling a partial population experiment. We're looking so we have a group of treated farmer group members in a community who received access to planting material. And then we're looking at what's driving the diffusion of that planting material to what we're going to call non-members, so farmers not in the farmer group, that live near them in the same communities. So just briefly there's a substantial literature, as I mentioned, that's grown up on this. What we're doing here relates to several strands of that literature, including the part of the literature that looked at the information content of networks. How does information move across networks? The Kramer-Miguel paper is the one on sustainability, not the Major Worms paper. There's another one on Babcock and Hartman that look at how roommates in dorms share information about access to a gym and other uses. The Conley and Udry paper is another example where they look at the dynamics of learning over time. And the Bandera and Rasul one is, what we're doing is very related to theirs because they're also looking at the returns to sizes of networks. We're going to show how social networks affect the probability of adoption and measure the size of those effects, and then we're going to try to tease out what's going on behind that. Is it primarily information? Is it access to technology? Or is it something else? Okay, so our sample design, as I said, we have 48 communities. Each of them has one treated farmer group in it. The treated farmer groups on average have 28 members. Communities on average have about 200 members. Our sample had 14 farmer group members per community and 5 non-members per community. Okay? And we're actually interested in what happens with these 5 non-members in each of these 48 communities. So in our data, we measure links to farmers. So we had a social networks module where we ask everybody in the sample about other individuals that they might know. We randomly selected for that discussion 4 of the farmer group members from their community and 4 of the farmer group non-members, and asked them. So those are randomly selected, and we said, do you know this person? And then we asked them some questions about their interactions with them and their relationships to them. So for each farmer group non-member, the person in the middle there, we know about 4 other non-members and about 4 randomly selected farmer group members. And we're going to use that information to look at the effects of social networks on their probabilities of adopting orange sweet potato. So this is what the information or the question looked like. In the period 6 to 18 months before Harvest Plus brought orange sweet potato to this place, have you or anyone else in your household had a conversation about farming or health with someone in, and then you name the household. You have the household head. You also have another variable that indicates the sort of common name that that person is known by in the community. So we actually gave them sort of several pieces of information about the household to just make sure whether or not they could accurately indicate, yeah, okay, we know them, or no, we don't. And that was our main measure of interaction or a link to this individual in terms of whether or not they're in your network. Now, we actually differentiated several types of networks. Acquaintance networks would be essentially if they indicated, yes, I know them, but then in subsequent questions indicated that they have no interaction with them, really. So they're aware of who they are, but they're just an acquaintance. The next level would be that they indicated they also have some social interaction with these people, but it pretty much stops at that level of a relationship. Another question indicated whether or not this person was an important source of information about farming and health. That's what we call the information network here, and that's the one that turns out to be the most important network. So there's already embedded in the way that we ask these questions some differentiation between which types of networks matter. Within the information network, we asked about levels of trust of these people and the quality of information that you get. We have a couple of measures of trust there and are able to differentiate different levels of trust. So we disaggregate the findings in that way too. So let me talk about the rates of diffusion. There was a lot of diffusion of orange sweet potato out of the farmer groups into the surrounding community during this project. So the project started in August 2007 and it ran for 2 full years. Each year has 2 farming seasons, okay? So people had 4 opportunities to gain access to orange sweet potato. These are, again, people not in the farmer group had access for 4 different opportunities to get some orange sweet potato from their neighbors in the farmer group and plant it. In the first season, 57% of non-members in our sample were able to do that. That's a remarkably high rate, and it means that people who in the farmer groups who got the planting material were immediately sharing it with their neighbors. It's quite encouraging, actually, and it also means that 20 kilos of planting material is probably a lot, because it was essentially very low cost to them to give it to their neighbors. So And then the adoption rate, so this is the rate of non-member households growing orange sweet potato in each season. You see a steady decline there and some kind of churning. Some people drop it and others come in and start growing it. But by the end of the project, 4 seasons in, the adoption rate of people that in the same community that were not farmer group members is still 43%. It's quite remarkable. It also means that we have a lot of variation in people's activities over the seasons that we're able to take advantage of to try to identify the effects of networks on adoption. Okay, so what's our identification strategy here? How are we going to measure this? The main equation that we're estimating is a model of adoption on the left-hand side, a dummy variable indicating whether or not the household was growing orange sweet potato in that season as a function of some measure T of the intensity of their interaction with treated farmer group members, okay? So it could be one of our preferred measures is the proportion of treated farmers that are in your network. So out of those 4 that we randomly asked you about, what proportion of them did you say you knew and were in your information network? Okay, that's going to be one of our sort of leading measures of intensity of your involvement with the treated network. Keep in mind, that's not the same of the proportion of all of your network that is treated, okay? It's a proportion of treated farmer group members that you said you knew. Okay, so that's our kind of very simple base model that we're going to estimate. Now keep in mind here, the treatment was randomly assigned across communities, right? But it was not randomly assigned within communities, and we're only working in communities that were randomly selected for treatment. So whether or not farmer group non-members gained access to the planting material is also related to the fact that the people they're gaining it from are farmer group members and they are not. And there may be some difference there. So we need to account for that. So one of the ways that we want to account for that is, what if some of these farmers that we're asking about, the non-member farmers, are just more gregarious? They're very social people, and so they have a bigger social network. Well, so we need to do something to account for network size, and that's both in terms of their size in and out of their network size in and out of the farmer group. So we have a control T again for their intensity of interaction with treated farmer group members. And we add, in the next set of specifications, controls for total network size in the community and also network density. It may be that larger communities, it's easier to have a bigger group of friends. It may be that some people are just, as I said, very gregarious, and that they're going to have a larger group of treated friends as well, or treated network members, just because they know a lot of people. So we need to control for that. Next, what if some non-members are just attracted to farmer group members? They say, these guys are special, and I want to hang out with them. They know things I don't know. I'm farming here, but I'm not doing that well. And if I go and spend more time with them, I'm going to get better at this. And so it may be that, but I'm talking now about the non-members themselves, may say, I'm going to learn something from them, and I'm going to react to that. Well, so maybe my characteristics as a non-member are affecting the probability that I know some of these treated farmer group members. It may be my education level, it may have something to do with my household size or where in the village I live. And so we need to add some controls for the characteristics of the non-members. So that's the matrix X there. We add a number of controls for that. Next, it may be that the farmer group members themselves are unique, and they're doing things that make it easier for me to gain access to them and know about them. Maybe they're all more gregarious, maybe they're more outgoing, maybe they think they know so much about farming that they go around talking about it a lot. So we need to also add some controls for the characteristics of the treated farmer group members, and while we're at it, we add average community level characteristics for other non-members as well. Ultimately, in some specifications, we add community fixed effects as well as a way to control for other unobserved variables. Okay. So here's the first set of results then. Now, what we're measuring here, in each of these cells is presenting the probability of non-farmer group members gaining access to and growing orange sweet potato in each season. In this case, I'm presenting results from season 1. That's when 57% of non-members gained access to planting material. So what we find here in the original specification with no no controls, you find broad effects of 3 different measures of interaction with the treated farmer group. But the preferred specification is the one all the way to the right, the 3rd column, where we add community fixed effects and all the other controls that I talked about. And what we find is that the only aspect of interaction with the treated farmer group that matters is whether you had at least one neighbor that was a treated farmer group member. It's saying that primarily the issue in the first season of whether or not you grew orange sweet potato is just gaining access. It's not primarily about the density of the network around you. If you knew at least one farmer who was in that farmer group, you had a dramatically high increase, a 23 percentage point increase in the probability that you were going to grow orange sweet potato in that season. It's an access story. This changes over time. So, but sorry, looking again at season 1, that result that I showed you is for the information network. Remember, we asked people about their acquaintance networks, their social networks, their information networks. These effects are being driven by the information network. People that they said, these are people that are a source of information for me about farming and health. We estimated the same models across the other components of networks. And here they are for acquaintance networks, social networks. The information network is the middle one. We look at trusted and well-trusted information sources. So within the information network, those people that you trust the most on character. The questions are about, would you leave your children with them if you had to go out of the community for an emergency? It's that type. It's not trust on farming. It's other measures of trust. They turn out not to matter. But you see, there's no effect of your acquaintance network here. There's no effect of your social network. It's an information network. So again, this provides pretty strong evidence, we think, that information is part of what's flowing through here. It may be a bit of updating of what you think, whether you think this crop is a valuable crop to grow. It may be about the agronomic characteristics of the crop or what you need to do to maintain it between seasons. It may have something to do with the nutritional characteristics of the crop, although when we looked at very specific messages on that, it doesn't show up. But clearly, some role of information is playing some role here.
Did you have questions before or after the farmer groups?
Sorry, so
Like,
we
the groups were already formed when you asked these questions about whether you knew them?
Yes, they were. Yes. I mean, a problem with social networks analysis in general is that it's completely it's endogenous in the sense that they form over time, and if you interrupt that formation, you're no longer measuring the same thing anymore. Katja Vasiliki has a very nice paper on the effects of increasing someone's social network, also in Uganda, on other agricultural behaviors. And she randomly does an encouragement that encourages people to increase the size of their social network. The problem is those new friends that you've made aren't really like your old friends in a lot of ways, we think. Right? And so that's a kind of dilemma within social networks analysis in general, that you're really trying to measure the embeddedness of relationships that you may have had. Some of them are new, some of them you had for a long time. And we're measuring essentially average returns over that. Okay, so we looked at future seasons as well. So now this is at the end of the project. This is our best glimpse on what the social network effects are going to look like over time. Again, let me remind you, this is 2 full years after the treated farmer group measures gained access to planting material. So whatever people are getting access to now has just been through the community itself and individual farmers maintaining planting material. Here you find not just an access story, but actually the density of the network around you matters. So it's not just, do you know at least somebody, but if you have more, there are returns to having a denser network of treated farmers around you. We differentiate this a little bit by conditioning the season 4 story on looking only at non-member households that actually originally got access to the planting material in season 1. So now we're asking, among non-member households that got it in the first season, what's the probability they're still growing orange sweet potato? That's what this is here. And here you see it's not access at all. Now it's only the density of the network that matters. You need to have a lot of people around you that are continuing to grow orange sweet potato in order to sustain or have this really large increase in your probability of continuing to grow it. So it suggests there are some equilibria that develop over time, where having a lot of people doing the same activity, particularly here, is going to be important to keeping it going. that has potentially large implications for Harvest Plus, which, as we say, is undertaking essentially a public health intervention to try to increase vitamin A intakes. And it means that they need to reach, there are some returns to having a lot of people in the same community growing orange sweet potato and consuming these crops. Okay, so we looked at a couple of other things. I'm not going to show you the results, and I'm out of time anyway. But we looked at whether heterogeneity in returns to orange sweet potato farming also affected these networked effects, and they do. So we differentiated. We predicted estimated returns to orange sweet potato farming across the sample of non-members, and those that were above the median, actually I said average here, but they're above the median predicted returns to orange sweet potato cultivation were both more likely to grow it, but also had larger network effects. And these network effects essentially disappeared for those that had really low returns. That makes sense, but it's also consistent with this emergent story that when we look at why adoption of some technologies is low, we have to differentiate farmers that have high returns and those that do not. The other thing we looked at was the intensity of information exchange. We asked people how often they spoke to these treated farmer group members, and that also turns out to matter. We measure it essentially as an association, but the number of conversations on average that you have with these treated farmer group members is associated both with the increase in probability of adoption in seasons 2, 3, and 4, but also among those that adopted in the first season with whether or not they're sustaining that adoption in season 4. So again, it's consistent with the earlier story that this communication is reinforcing and providing some sources of information. So our results on the spread question, why are some farmers growing it and some not? We found that non-members with at least one treated information neighbor can gain access to vines in the first season. It's consistent with a search process where people are primarily focused at that stage with just gaining access to the technology. The stick question is much more about why people continue to grow this over time, and there the story shifts, and there's evidence that having a lot of people around you undertaking this activity is in some way self-sustaining and encourages diffusion. Again, we think some of that is information. It may be that it may not be direct communication of specific facts. It may be that people react to what they know about their neighbors and say, well, a lot of these guys are still growing that. They've been doing it for a few seasons now, and they're actually still growing it. It's a form of Bayesian updating of priors to say, I now think this is a more valuable crop, not due to any specific information about the crop necessarily, but by the fact that a lot of people around me are continuing to grow it. And these are people that I consider to be important sources of information about farming, so I'm going to keep doing it too. So that idea of almost something closer to mimicry as opposed to specific learning is something that we're trying to tease out. We have measures of knowledge about vitamin A and about farming in both the baseline and end-line surveys, so we're going to use that to try to pull this apart. That's kind of next steps. We're also using this information in some new experiments working with Harvest Plus in Uganda. They are scaling up orange sweet potato there with support from Feed the Future, and we're designing some new experiments with them to look at what types of diffusion matter, in part by using opinion leaders and different rates of saturation of orange sweet potato in the community to try to get a little bit further on these ideas. Thanks.